The moment her fingers brushed his wrist, I knew we had already crossed a line no deck of cards could redraw. Disclaimer: this story contains mature themes intended for adult viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. It was supposed to be harmless. 4 friends, a quiet Friday night, a bottle of wine breathing between us, and a deck of cards that felt heavier than it should have. We had known each other for years, shared holidays, shared secrets, shared long looks that lingered a second too long when our spouses weren't paying attention. Or maybe they were. She suggested strip poker with a laugh that sounded playful, but her eyes didn't laugh. They studied us, studied me, as if she already knew how the night would unfold. Her husband leaned back in his chair, confidence etched into the way he shuffled the cards. Mine met my gaze across the table, a slow smile spreading across his lips. The kind that used to make my knees weak when we were younger. At first it was teasing, a jacket tossed over a shoulder, a heel slipping off beneath the table. Every loss drew a cheer, every win carried a subtle charge. The air thickened, heavy with perfume and wine and something unspoken that had been waiting for an excuse to surface. What held us back wasn't modesty, it was history, loyalty, the fragile structure of marriages built on trust and routine. We weren't reckless people, we were adults who had built careful lives. But careful lives sometimes starve the parts of us that crave risk. I started losing more than hands of cards. When the final round turned against me, silence fell. My heart pounded so loudly I wondered if they could hear it over the soft jazz humming in the background. There was laughter, but it was softer now, slower, edged with anticipation. I stood, feeling every pair of eyes on me, every breath shared in the room. He offered his lap with a half-smile that dared me to refuse. I didn't. The moment I settled there, the world shifted. It wasn't about the game anymore. It was about proximity. Heat, the awareness of another heartbeat against mine. His hands rested carefully at my waist, respectful but not distant. My husband's jaw tightened, yet he didn't look away, and she watched us like she was reading the final chapter of a book she had been writing for months. Then she stood. If what I did was surrender, what she did was declaration. She walked around the table slowly, fingertips grazing the polished wood, her gaze locked on my husband. The space between them felt electric, alive with every unsaid question they'd buried during dinners and double dates. When she leaned close to him, when he reached for her instinctively, something silent and mutual passed between all 4 of us. No one spoke, no one needed to. The cards lay forgotten, scattered like evidence of our last attempt at innocence. We weren't drunk, we weren't careless, we were aware, painfully aware of every choice being made in that room. It wasn't about jealousy, it was about curiosity, about seeing your partner through someone else's eyes and realizing desire doesn't always diminish, sometimes it multiplies. Sometimes it transforms. My fingers curled slightly against the fabric of his shirt as I tried to steady my breathing. Across the table her laughter softened into something more intimate. The music continued to play, absurdly ordinary against the storm building inside us. And then came the pause. That suspended second where any one of us could have stood up, brushed off the tension, declared the game over and returned to safety. No one moved. Because in that stillness we understood something dangerous, that we had opened a door none of us had known how to unlock before. And whether we stepped through it or not, we would never sit around a table together the same way again. The cards remained untouched. And the night was far from over. The cards stayed scattered, but none of us reached for them. The silence didn't feel awkward anymore. It felt intentional, like a held breath we were all sharing. I slowly rose from his lap, though the warmth lingered where I'd been sitting. His hand slipped away carefully, almost reluctantly, as if letting go required effort. When our eyes met there was something unguarded there. Not triumph, not mischief, something softer, something that mirrored the storm inside me. Across the table she hadn't moved far from my husband. She stood close enough that their knees brushed. He didn't shift away. Instead he tilted his head slightly, studying her as if seeing her clearly for the first time, or maybe allowing himself to admit he'd always noticed. "You okay?" her husband asked me quietly. His voice was steady but lower than before, intimate, concerned or curious. "I think so," I replied, though my voice came out softer than I intended. The music flowed around us, smooth and unhurried. The room felt smaller now, warmer, charged in ways that had nothing to do with bare skin and everything to do with vulnerability. I walked back to my seat slowly, aware of every step, every subtle glance exchanged in the room. When I sat down, my knee brushed his under the table. It could have been accidental. It wasn't. Neither of us pulled away. On the other side, she finally sat beside my husband instead of across from him. That small shift changed the geometry of everything. Her shoulder barely touched his arm, but that sliver of contact seemed louder than words. He looked at me once, searching maybe, and I couldn't tell if he was asking for permission or offering reassurance. What were we doing? No one said it aloud, but the question hovered above the table like the dim chandelier light. Her fingers reached for her wine glass at the same time his did. Their hands brushed. She didn't apologize. He didn't either. Instead, they both smiled, faint, knowing smiles that made something twist deep in my chest. Jealousy wasn't sharp like I'd expected. It was warm, complicated. It made my pulse race, but it also made me feel intensely alive. You ever think, she said softly, tracing the rim of her glass, that sometimes we pretend not to notice things because it's easier? Her eyes flicked to me when she said it. My breath caught. Notice what? I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. The way energy shifts, she replied, between people. Her husband leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. Watching all of us. There was no anger in his expression. Only awareness. My husband cleared his throat quietly. Energy doesn't mean intention. No, she agreed. But it doesn't mean it's not there either. The honesty in the room was becoming heavier than the tension had been. Under the table, I felt his hand move just slightly, resting on his thigh near mine. Not touching. Close enough that if I shifted an inch, our fingers would intertwine. I didn't move, because something still held me back. Years of shared mornings. Promises whispered in darker, quieter bedrooms. The safety of knowing exactly who would be beside me when the lights went out. But safety had never felt like this. Her husband stood suddenly, walking toward the window as if he needed air. The city lights beyond the glass reflected against his silhouette. I watched him, drawn by the controlled way he moved, like he was carefully measuring each step. Are we crossing a line? I asked, the words barely above a whisper. No one answered immediately. My husband finally spoke. Maybe the line's been there longer than we thought. That confession settled over me like a slow-burning flame. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers grazing my husband's sleeve again, lighter this time, almost testing. He didn't flinch, he didn't lean closer either. He just looked at me, always back to me. That was the part that undid me. No matter where the current pulled, our eyes kept finding each other. There was no secrecy here, no betrayal in shadows. Everything was happening in plain sight, which somehow made it more intimate. Her husband returned from the window and sat closer to me this time. Close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his arm. If anyone wants to stop, he said gently, we stop. It wasn't a challenge, it was a boundary offered openly. I swallowed. I don't want to stop, she admitted first. The room went still. My husband exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding that breath for weeks. Neither do I. All eyes turned to me. My heart thundered against my ribs, loud and insistent. This wasn't about the game anymore. It wasn't about curiosity alone. It was about trust and the terrifying thrill of standing at the edge of something unknown together. I hesitated, searching for words big enough to hold what I felt. I don't want to lose what we already have. You won't, my husband said immediately. His voice was firm, certain. Not if we're honest. Honesty. That was the fragile thread holding us steady over dangerous ground. Her husband's hand finally brushed mine, slowly, deliberately. Not gripping, just resting there, waiting to see if I'd pull away. I didn't. The contact was simple, warm, steady, but it sent a ripple through the room that none of us could ignore. Across from me, she watched with parted lips. My husband's hand found hers at the same time. 4 people, 2 marriages, 1 shared moment balanced between restraint and surrender. The music swelled softly in the background. No one kissed, no one rushed forward. We just sat there, hands intertwined, hearts racing, knowing the next choice would change everything. And still, none of us let go. The room had changed. What started as a playful game now hummed with unspoken awareness, each glance and gesture charged with subtle electricity. I couldn't help noticing the way his eyes lingered on me, softening and sharpening all at once, as if he were trying to read my mind without asking. Every time our hands brushed, intentionally or not, a shiver ran along my spine, reminding me how thin the line between curiosity and desire really was. She laughed softly at something across the table, the sound light, teasing, but it carried an edge I couldn't ignore. Her shoulder lightly brushed her husband's as she leaned toward him, and my chest tightened. He didn't pull away, he didn't lean closer either. Instead, he seemed to measure the space, like he was learning something about her in real time, while his gaze flickered to mine just enough to remind me that nothing had truly shifted between us, not yet. I shifted in my seat, my knee brushing his once more. A simple contact, almost accidental, yet my stomach nodded in response. I wanted to pull away, to reclaim the composure I'd worked so hard to maintain, but something about the warmth radiating from him under the table made me hesitate. Our eyes met, and in that brief second, the room's energy condensed into a single unspoken understanding. None of us could pretend everything was normal tonight. He cleared his throat lightly, a signal that broke the tension just enough to breathe yet didn't diffuse it entirely. "Are you comfortable?" he asked, careful, deliberate, his voice low and intimate. I nodded, though my heart betrayed me. "I think so," I whispered. The words sounded fragile, unsteady, but he understood. He always seemed to understand before I could fully explain. Across the table her laughter softened as she leaned closer to her husband, resting her hand lightly on the back of his chair. The smallest, most innocent touch, and yet it sent a ripple through the room. I caught my own breath, realizing how much I was aware of every move, every micro-gesture. The simple act of sitting across from them had become a dance of restraint, a delicate negotiation of curiosity, loyalty and temptation. "I never realized how much we notice," she said softly, eyes flicking toward me for a fraction of a second. "Even when we try not to." Her words lingered, heavy and warm, carrying a truth we all felt but dared not name. I could feel it in the way my husband's hand flexed slightly in his lap, in the steady, controlled exhalation she released as she traced the rim of her glass, in the almost imperceptible shift of his body closer to mine without crossing any line. My fingers itched to move, to reach for him, yet restraint held me back, a tether of familiarity, of promises, of the life we had built. But it wasn't just hesitation, it was fascination too. The way desire seemed to hover between us, palpable and teasing, made the room smaller and the world quieter. He caught my gaze again and didn't look away. A single smile tugged at his lips, subtle, knowing, dangerous in its simplicity. I returned it almost involuntarily, and my chest ached with the thrill of recognition. For a moment I imagined what it would feel like to close that distance, to lean into the tension instead of away from it, but I swallowed the thought, letting it hover in the charged air between us. Her husband's movement beside me drew my attention. He leaned slightly, almost brushing my shoulder. My breath caught, a silent acknowledgement passing through that near contact. It was fleeting yet heavy with everything we hadn't said. Across from us they watched, yet did not interfere, their own silent understanding mirrored in the subtle tightening of her hand on his arm. Time seemed to stretch, each second filled with whispered possibilities, tentative touches and the kind of awareness that made the ordinary extraordinary. Every glance, every smile, every accidental brush of a hand became a conversation of its own, deep and unhurried, drawing all four of us into a shared moment that defied explanation. The music played softly, almost indifferent to the storm of emotion it accompanied. I shifted again, not moving closer but not pulling away either. The line between restraint and surrender was thinner than ever, yet none of us crossed it, at least, not yet. We were bound together by curiosity, by trust, by an undeniable pull that made everything else fade. The night stretched on, intimate, tense, unspoken and unresolved, a moment suspended in possibility. The air in the apartment had shifted into something almost tangible, a dense current of unspoken longing and restrained energy. Every glance carried weight, every movement echoed in the charged silence. I found myself noticing the small things I had never allowed myself to see before. The way his hand lingered near mine. The subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze softened when it landed on me. Desire hummed beneath it all, thick and insistent, but no one dared give it voice. Across the table she adjusted her posture, sitting a little straighter, almost defiant, almost teasing, as her husband's eyes followed her every move. The closeness they shared, simple gestures like brushing against an arm or leaning slightly, mirrored the tension I felt beside my own. The room had become a stage where each of us played with fire, yet no flames had dared to ignite. I shifted in my chair, letting my knee brush his again, softly this time, almost casual. His fingers twitched, a subtle electric reaction, and I caught my breath. There was a temptation to reach farther, to close the distance between us, but something held me back. It wasn't fear, it wasn't guilt. It was the weight of knowing that what we were feeling was fragile, forbidden and extraordinary all at once. He met my gaze, and in that look 1,000 words passed silently between us. Longing, hesitation, curiosity, regret, perhaps. And maybe even the thrilling recognition that neither of us could pretend it wasn't there. I wanted him. I wanted to collapse into that heat, to surrender to it fully. But I also wanted more than the moment. I wanted control composure and the assurance that nothing would be broken by a misstep. Her laughter rang out lightly, breaking the momentary tension, but even it seemed colored with something unspoken. She watched us, or perhaps she watched him, her eyes softening for a fraction too long, revealing just enough to stir the currents in the room. I felt my pulse quicken, aware of how thin the walls were between us all. A brush of fingertips under the table, a shared glance across the dim light, every subtle gesture seemed magnified, stretched by the anticipation that neither of us could dispel. At one point he leaned just slightly toward me, close enough that the warmth of his shoulder pressed against mine. I could feel the heat radiating and my stomach tightened. His breath brushed the edge of my ear as he whispered something mundane, yet my heart hammered at the nearness. I wanted to turn into him, to lean into the pull, but I held myself back. Not because I didn't want it, quite the opposite, but because wanting it too much made it unbearable. Pulling away was the only way to survive the intensity. She shifted in her chair beside her husband, mirroring our tension. Their proximity was a reminder that we weren't alone in this delicate web. The room seemed suspended in time, each second stretching into infinity as we navigated the invisible lines of connection and restraint. I wanted to speak, to break the silence, but words would have betrayed too much too soon. Instead, we communicated through glances and micro-movements. A hand brushing against the table near another's, a small inhale at a shared joke, a laugh that lingered longer than necessary. Every signal was a secret conversation, a mutual acknowledgement that we were teetering on the edge of something that could not be named aloud. I caught myself imagining what it would feel like to close the distance fully, to let the tension dissolve into something tangible. My mind raced with possibilities, but then reason, loyalty, and the weight of reality pulled me back. Desire and responsibility wrestled for dominance, leaving me simultaneously on fire and frozen. He shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, his fingers grazing mine again, brief, teasing, electric. I didn't move, I couldn't, not yet. Pulling away too soon would be a relief. Pulling closer too soon would be surrender. And surrender felt deliciously impossible. The soft jazz playing in the background became a rhythm for the unspoken. A pulse, a heartbeat that matched my own. We were dancing in the margins of restraint, caught in a delicate balance between longing and hesitation. The tension wasn't going anywhere, and neither were we. Across the room they were caught in their own mirrored conflict, creating a symphony of unspoken emotions that filled every inch of space. Desire, curiosity, hesitation, and restraint, layered like the shadows cast by the warm ambient lights, hung over us, binding the four of us in a shared, unspoken truth. Something significant had begun, and it would change everything, whether we acted on it or not. And yet for now we remained suspended, longing, aware, and achingly close in the space between wanting and surrender, letting the tension breathe in a heat that was almost unbearable, but entirely ours. The room had shrunk around us. Every glance felt like it carried weight, every breath seemed amplified in the warm, low-lit air. I could hear the subtle intake of breath from across the table, the quiet exhale that followed, and it drew me in as much as it terrified me. The space between us, between him and me, felt electric, charged with unspoken words and emotions that neither of us had dared to name. He shifted slightly in his seat, and the brush of his sleeve against my arm was enough to make my pulse catch. It wasn't deliberate, and yet it was deliberate in the way only instinct knows. My fingers itched to reach for him, to close the infinitesimal gap, but I stayed still, letting the tension thrum like a low note under our conversation. We spoke in half-sentences, glances, and tiny smiles that hovered on the edge of confession. Across the table their laughter had faded, replaced by a quiet hum of awareness. She watched us just barely, and her husband's eyes flickered to mine again, not accusing, not inviting, just noticing, understanding. Their presence didn't diminish the tension, it amplified it, creating a web of emotions that pulled at me from every direction. I leaned slightly forward, drawn by the heat of proximity, and he mirrored me just a fraction. Our shoulders almost touched. The air between us seemed to thicken, to vibrate with possibility. Every subtle movement, a hair brushing a cheek, a hand shifting near a knee, a fleeting gaze, became a conversation of its own, deeper than words could ever carry. I began, my voice barely above a whisper. The word trembled, unsteady, fragile. My chest tightened as the unspoken weight of it hung between us. He leaned in just enough that I could feel the warmth of him, the silent promise that he was listening, that he understood. Yes, he murmured, the single syllable gentle and raw, filled with curiosity and care. The hum of the city outside the windows, the soft jazz lingering in the background, and the muted clink of glasses became a symphony for the tension. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs, each beat loud in the suspended air. I don't know how to stop noticing you, I whispered finally, letting the words spill despite my fear. His eyes softened, a flicker of something unguarded and immediate crossing his expression. The faintest brush of his fingers along the edge of mine, accidental or not, sent a jolt up my arm. I inhaled sharply, not moving, letting the contact linger, the silence growing around it, thick and heavy. For a moment it felt as if time had halted. The room no longer contained 4 people, it contained only him and me, orbiting a gravity we hadn't dared to acknowledge. The heat between us was palpable, a living thing that drew my gaze to his lips, to the slow rhythm of his breathing, to the steady intensity in his eyes. He didn't speak, I didn't speak, but the silence spoke volumes. Every shift of his weight, every subtle tilt of his head, every glance that found mine carried a confession deeper than words, a mixture of longing, fear, and trust that made the moment feel fragile and infinite all at once. My hand twitched, hovering near his as if it wanted to rest there, to anchor myself in him. He leaned ever so slightly, a careful tentative movement, not enough to break the line of restraint, but enough that I could feel it. The space between us seemed to shrink until it was almost tangible, almost touchable, a thin current that pulled and held us both. Do you feel it too? I breathed, letting the question hang like smoke in the air. His gaze held mine, unwavering, and for a heartbeat the room seemed to disappear. He nodded, the faintest of nods, full of weight and unspoken acknowledgement. That simple motion, the acknowledgement that he felt the same invisible pull, set my chest ablaze. The city lights beyond the window painted soft glimmers across his face, highlighting the slight tilt of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders, the warmth of his presence so near that I could almost touch it. My fingers itched, trembling with a hunger I refused to name. And then, silence. Absolute, heavy, electric. The kind that stretches infinitely, as if the world has shrunk to this one suspended, excruciatingly intimate moment. The air between us trembled with the weight of what might happen next, every nerve ending alive with anticipation, every heartbeat synchronized with the unspoken pull. Neither of us moved, neither of us spoke, but the space between us had already said everything. The moment hung there, fragile and intense, poised on the edge of something inevitable, as if the next breath, the next move, could tip the world into a storm of feeling that we weren't ready to name yet. The night had deepened, and the apartment seemed to pulse with a quiet electric rhythm. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows, a soft percussion that wrapped the room in intimacy, isolating us from the world beyond the glass. The warm light from the chandelier pooled around us in golden circles, catching the shimmer of wine glasses and the polished surface of the table. But the real illumination came from the tension that had finally found release. We moved closer without thinking, guided by something older and wilder than reason. Her breath melted into his, a whispering warmth that carried a confession neither had dared speak aloud. The air between them vibrated, charged with emotion, with desire distilled into its purest form, connection. They didn't need words. Their bodies spoke the words that hung between them, unspoken and urgent, filling every corner of the room with their rhythm. The faint brush of his hand against hers under the table was enough to make the world dissolve. Fingers twined with fingers, not in haste but with deliberate, careful attention, savoring the texture, the heat, the closeness. Every touch was amplified, magnified by the months, maybe years, of restrained longing. Every shift, every slight brush of skin became a message, a soft revelation that told them they were finally present, finally here, finally daring to exist in each other's space fully. I watched from the other side of the table, heart hammering in my chest. The sight of them leaning just slightly, of shoulders brushing and hair catching the soft light, made my pulse feel both fragile and fierce. Even in the periphery, the intimacy they shared set fire to everything around them. It was palpable, intoxicating, a delicate intoxication of warmth and closeness. She tilted her head toward him, their foreheads almost touching, a slow inhale connecting them. His hand cupped the side of her face gently, thumb brushing along the curve of her jaw. The contact was tender, reverent, every motion slow, deliberate, like they were savoring a taste they had dreamed of but never touched before. Their eyes met, unguarded, luminous with shared understanding, and the room seemed to hold its breath in reverence of their surrender. I could hear their breathing, quiet but deep, synchronized in a rhythm that mirrored the storm of emotion in the room. The rain outside tapped more urgently now, echoing the pulse inside us. Each sigh, each subtle shift of their bodies carried weight and meaning. They moved as if guided by the music of the night, a slow melodic choreography of longing fulfilled and boundaries gently dissolved. I shifted slightly in my chair, feeling my own warmth, my own desire, but it wasn't envy. It was reverence, awe at the elegance of the moment, the restraint that had led to release, the beauty of the unspoken in every glance, every touch. Their intimacy wasn't frantic, it was deliberate, deliciously restrained, a dance on the edge of vulnerability and courage. When he leaned slightly closer, their lips almost grazing, the world outside disappeared. The city, the cards, the table, nothing mattered except the quiet heat that wrapped around them like a second skin. They let themselves exist in this shared cocoon, letting time stretch, letting the rain, the light, the warmth and the slow rhythm of their proximity carry them further than words could ever reach. Her fingers curved around his, gripping gently, anchoring, and his thumb traced circles along her knuckles. That simple motion, so intimate, so human, became the embodiment of everything they had withheld and everything they now allowed themselves to feel. A shiver ran between them, silent, electric, breathtaking. Their laughter was soft, breathy, a sound of joy mingled with relief. Their smiles were slow, the kind that melts into the eyes and lingers in the soul. And yet no explicit gestures were necessary. Every inch of closeness, every shiver, every shared breath conveyed the passion, the vulnerability and the surrender. The rain outside softened to a gentle patter, the night's chill held at bay by the warmth in the room. Everything was quiet except for the whispered breaths, the near touch of skin and the shared heartbeat that seemed to echo in the space between them. The night stretched infinitely, a canvas for desire and intimacy painted with restraint, warmth and elegance. In that moment they had let go. They had surrendered to the pull, the tension, the longing, and yet it was breathtakingly gentle, poetic, alive. They didn't need more. The room, the rain, the golden light, and their closeness spoke volumes. They were finally here, finally present, finally together in a way that words could never fully capture. Morning light filtered softly through the blinds, painting pale stripes across the polished wooden floor. The apartment was quiet, almost eerily so, the kind of quiet that followed a storm, the aftermath of emotions too intense to be contained. I sat at the edge of the couch, hands wrapped around a mug of cooling coffee, staring at the steam as if it could carry away the heaviness pressing on my chest. Last night had been alive with a tension that finally surrendered to closeness, but morning brought a weight I hadn't anticipated. He moved across the room, slow, deliberate, as if even the air needed permission to carry him. His eyes met mine, not with the fire of last night, but with something deeper, softer, almost raw. There was no need to speak. Our silence held 100 confessions, 1,000 half-formed questions. I wanted to reach for him, to bridge the distance, but part of me hesitated. Was it love? Was it relief? Or just the echo of a night where everything we'd restrained had been set free? The rain had stopped, leaving the windows misted and the world outside washed clean. Light played against the furniture, tracing the curves of the room, and for a fleeting second the curves of our emotions tangled, beautiful and messy. I realized that the line between desire and truth had blurred. We had shared something intimate, and yet the implications weren't simple. Guilt hovered in the corners, unspoken but not overwhelming. It was tempered by the wonder of having finally let ourselves exist fully in each other's presence. He sat beside me just close enough that our knees brushed and I felt the familiar pull, the current that had drawn us together the night before. But now it was different. Quiet, unrushed, more profound. His hand hovered near mine, a tentative offering, and when our fingers finally met, it wasn't urgent. It was acknowledgement of the night, of the bond, of the complexity we were entangled in. Across the room they lingered in their own silence. She sipped her tea, eyes tracing patterns in the steam, while her husband stood near the window staring out as if searching for answers in the city beyond. We had all crossed boundaries, shared glances and touches that had been impossible in the ordinary flow of life. And yet the morning light revealed not regret, but a strange sort of peace, an understanding that we were human and humans were messy, and sometimes the heart needed its truths to be felt before they could be spoken. I finally spoke, the words careful, tentative. Do you regret it? He shook his head, a slow, certain motion. No, he said, but it changes things, doesn't it? I nodded, feeling the weight of it settle over me like a cloak. Everything had changed, our connection, our awareness, the invisible lines that had once kept us apart. We were closer now, but the closeness was delicate, precarious, something to be handled with care. A knock at the door shattered the fragile calm. All four of us jumped slightly, and a ripple of surprise passed through the room. She exchanged a glance with her husband, and he murmured something under his breath before moving to open it. The visitor was unexpected, a mutual friend we hadn't anticipated, someone who had always been a part of our larger circle. Their presence brought a jolt of reality crashing into the intimacy we had wrapped ourselves in. Conversation began, polite and careful, yet underneath it all the tension lingered, a quiet hum that refused to dissipate. Even amidst the intrusion I felt it, the afterglow of last night's surrender. Every glance at him, every accidental brush of the hand, carried the weight of the moment we had shared. It was not lust, it was not fleeting, it was the realization that the bond between us had deepened in ways that would not easily be undone. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through me, mingling with the residue of excitement and vulnerability. We had crossed a line, yes, but we had also reached a space of understanding, a place where truth could be acknowledged without words. That tension, still alive and humming, had become a connection messy, human, and utterly breathtaking. And as the visitor chatted obliviously about plans for the day, I realized that our lives had shifted subtly, irrevocably. The morning held guilt, uncertainty, and fragile peace, but it also held promise. A promise that we had finally seen each other, truly, and that whatever came next, love, desire, or escape, would be richer for having survived the night. The morning light had softened into mid-morning gold, spilling across the apartment in gentle pools. We sat quietly, side by side, the tension from the night before transformed into something warmer, something quieter. His hand rested lightly over mine, fingers intertwined without urgency, carrying the weight of everything we had shared, the anticipation, the longing, the courage to feel what we had hidden. She leaned back beside her husband, a soft smile curling at the edges of her lips. Their eyes met ours across the room, and in that glance there was understanding, not judgment. The storm of desire and hesitation had passed, leaving a delicate calm in its place, like a tide that had run its course and left the shore renewed. I tilted my head toward him and he leaned down just enough for our foreheads to touch. A slow inhale, a quiet exhale. The kind of contact that carried more intimacy than words ever could. His warmth pressed against mine, steady and grounding, a reminder that sometimes closeness didn't need drama to be profound. Our hearts had chosen a rhythm of peace, unspoken but deeply felt, and in that moment everything else fell away. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the city outside, and yet it was full of the echoes of laughter, whispers, and touches that would linger forever in memory. We didn't need to speak about what had happened. The memory of the night's closeness, the vulnerability, the spark between us would always remain, a perfume that lingered long after the moment passed. I rested my head lightly against his shoulder and he pressed a soft kiss to my forehead, a promise in the simplest gesture. The connection between us had deepened in ways that were both fragile and enduring. It didn't need words to be known. It didn't need resolution to be real. Outside, the sun climbed higher, filling the room with light. Inside, we remained in our quiet orbit, hearts synchronized, breaths mingled, hands still joined. The world outside could wait. For now there was only this tenderness, understanding, and a closeness that was as much emotional as it was physical. It was the kind of ending that wasn't dramatic, that didn't need flourish. It was real, human, and infinitely intimate. A closure not of forgetting, but of remembering. A memory that would linger, soft and warm like a whispered secret shared between hearts.